My name is Charlotte Peters-Rock. My profession at the moment seems to be protest.
What brings you to Cato Street today?
I've brought you the peaceful weavers of Peterloo. The Peterloo massacre, the Manchester massacre, took place about 6 months before the Cato Street conspiracy was found. And therefore there is a direct correlation between the two.
Why have you been inspired by the story of Peterloo?
Because it is a way in which government keeps the people down. It attacks them with sabres, it threatens them, it lies about them, it hangs them in the case of the Cato Street conspirators, it transports them, and yet these are people still trying to just live.
What sources did you use for your Peterloo show?
I used a lot of original sources. The statements that were made by the enormous number of people who were harmed. There were in excess of 650 people out of 60 to 80,000 who were seriously harmed at the Manchester massacre at Peterloo. And there were also at least 20 people known to have been killed, though there could have been many more, who would say that a family member had died, who would tell the authorities that. So therefore, this is something which eventually brought statements into court because Henry Hunt and various others were arrested and they were jailed, and a lot of people made statements in their defence. And also there were a lot of sort of inquests, none of which were well held, and a lot of people had statements for that time. They also had a fund set up to try to help the badly injured because they had no other source of help really. And if the wage earner was injured or killed, that left the family starving. So a lot of people who had money put money in, and it was written against each name as to what injuries they'd had. So there were a lot of statements there, telling the ages, where they'd come from and all this. And the original record was just brilliant for Peterloo because an enormous number of people were harmed and killed.
What was it about Peterloo that spurred the Cato Street conspirators into action?
It was the fact that so many people were treated so badly, quite deliberately, and with earlier planning by the authorities. When you have yeomen all drunk, hussars all drunk, magistrates notably drunk from the night before and still drinking first thing in the morning before this massacre happened, they had planned this out carefully. They went riding amongst the crowd, which was packed tight in the area. They couldn't get away from the horses. A lot of them were trodden by the horses. Shod hooves onto your feet and legs. You can imagine it. They couldn't get away. The panic didn't allow them to get away. So there were people smothered under the ruck of people as they tried to leave. There were yeomen slashing at heads, slashing to take away the caps of liberty as well, because some people were wearing them and some had them on the top of banners. There were lots of banners brought into the square as well as just people. Banners asking for reform. None of them threatening. Deliberately, carefully, none of them threatening. And yet what happens finally is that all the people are quelled to that extent. It's appalling. And how do you walk home if you've walked 30 miles to get there and one of your family members is injured badly? How do you get them home? With no money.
Why is the story of Peterloo and Cato Street still important to us in 2020?
Because what those people wanted was reform. What we want now is reform. What they were begging for was the vote for every man. It's important because the women's group set up then. The female reform movement started in the Middleton area of Manchester, north of Manchester, about a fortnight before the Peterloo massacre. That was the point where women got up in great numbers, peacefully, bringing their children with them who could walk, and thereby exposing them to what happened on St. Peter's Field. But they brought them to show that they had no evil intent. They weren't there to create a riot. They were there to beg for help, and that's why they came to speak to to listen to Henry Hunt speaking because he was pushing for reform of Parliament, and that would have meant that they would have changed so that Manchester, which had no Member of Parliament at the time and was growing rapidly because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the industrial looms coming in and taking over from the hand looms, he was trying to get an MP for such areas as that, and Birmingham, which also had no MP. And at that point, there were only 2 members of Parliament for the whole of Lancashire. But Manchester was excluded. There was nothing for Manchester. There was no representation. And in the same way now, what we have is we're coming out of Europe. We're claiming we don't have adequate representation in Europe because people have voted to come out. Large numbers of us feel we don't have adequate representation here either because people don't listen. We have authorities who have police that we pay for, but they don't work for us, they work for the authority. And therefore the situation, it's ongoing, but it's very similar to what happened then, which was they're pushing people's faces into the gutter. We have people sleeping on the streets all over the country. That shouldn't be happening.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you haven't been asked about that you think you'd like to add about the history and about?
Well, the main thing I'd add, certainly having looked at it carefully and written around it, is the fact that there were protests going on throughout the whole of the 19th century by ordinary people. And mainly what they needed was to be able to eat and to be able to feed their children. And they weren't looking for handouts, they were looking for secure work that would allow them to do it. And we're still in the same situation, largely because people think, well, somebody else will do something about this. And what we need to do is stand up for ourselves and do something about it. And I think that's extremely important. We're busy at the moment changing the way the Labour Party works, for instance. And I'm a member. And the point about this is that I believe that there should be fairness for everybody. We shouldn't all swing on the rope and take money when we're not due it, unless we happen to be disabled enough to need that, in which case people should be looked after. But this idea of everything has to be commercialised, that we're just units in somebody else's table, is just not adequate. That's what I think about Peterloo. I think it about Cato Street. I know Cato Street was deliberately caused as well. There were spies that were put in particularly. They were acting at Peterloo. They were acting at various other massacres, various other marches all over the country. There were always spies in, government spies. And the reason was they were terrified that we'd move in one day, as the Cato Street conspirators thought they probably could, and chop off all their heads and have the sort of revolution they had in France. And you see now, the French are still revolting. They say, no, we're not going to have this, you'll have to stop it. I think pensions have just been altered now by the French government because the people have been on the streets now for months on end. We have to fight our corner, really.